Picture this: a quiet kid, a small town park, and a pack of leather-clad bikers rolling in like thunder on wheels. They thought they'd found an easy target, someone to break, someone to bury. But what happens when the prey turns predator? When a 16-year-old with a book in his hand and a storm in his soul flips the script on a gang out for blood? This isn't just a fight, it's a reckoning, a secret unraveling under the moonlight, and a twist you'll never see coming. Who's the real threat here? Stick around to find out, because this story's about to blow your mind. If you're ready for a tale of guts, grit, and glory, smash that like button right now. It's your ticket to the ride. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a second of this action, and drop a comment below. What would you do if the storm came for you? Let's get into it. The sun was bleeding out over Fairview, Connecticut, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold as it sank behind the jagged tree line. It wasn't the kind of quiet, postcard-perfect evening you'd expect from a small-town park. No, this was chaos in motion. Kids screaming as they chased a soccer ball across the patchy field, the sharp scent of freshly cut grass cutting through the air, and the distant hum of traffic buzzing like a restless hive. Amid it all, Ethan Caldwell sat alone on a weathered bench beneath the sprawling arms of an old oak tree, his lean frame slouched casually in a black hoodie and ripped jeans. At 16, he didn't scream, "Tough guy," not with his messy dark hair falling over those piercing hazel eyes that seemed to see straight through you. One AirPod dangled from his ear, the other tucked in his pocket, while his fingers flipped through the worn pages of The Art of War. He wasn't reading it to look cool. Ethan lived it, every word, every strategy etched into his bones. He was there for one reason: to wait for his little brother, Lucas, Luke to everyone who knew him, a scrappy 10-year-old with a mop of blonde curls, still out there kicking up dirt on the soccer field. Ethan had promised their mom he'd walk Luke home, and Ethan didn't break promises. Not ever. The park was alive around him, parents chatting on the sidelines, a couple of teens tossing a frisbee. But Ethan kept to himself, his focus split between the book and the occasional glance toward the field. That's when it happened. The air shifted. A low, guttural roar tore through the evening, like a predator announcing its arrival. Ethan didn't look up right away, even as the ground vibrated beneath his sneakers. Motorcycles. 5 of them, gleaming under the dying sunlight, rolled into the park's gravel lot with all the subtlety of a thunderclap. Harley-Davidsons, polished to a mirror shine, their engines snarling loud enough to drown out the kids' laughter. The riders weren't weekend hobbyists in shiny new gear. These guys were rough, leather jackets creaking with every move, boots scuffed from too many miles, and a stench of motor oil and stale cigarettes trailing behind them like a shadow. Ethan's eyes flicked up briefly, catching the glint of chrome and the way the lead biker, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a snake tattoo curling around his thick neck, swung his leg off the bike with deliberate menace. The others followed, their movements synced like a pack of wolves, scanning the park with cold, predatory stares. Most people didn't notice. The soccer moms kept gossiping, the kids kept running. But Ethan felt it, the weight of their gaze locking onto him like a sniper's crosshairs. His stomach tightened just for a second, but he forced it down, turning back to his book. "Let your plans be dark and impenetrable as night," he muttered under his breath, tracing Sun Tzu's words with his thumb. Trouble was coming. He could smell it. The bikers didn't waste time. Gravel crunched under their boots as they strode across the lot, bypassing the picnic tables and the playground, heading straight for him. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't fidget. He'd learned that from his dad, Jack, a former Marine who'd taught him to keep his cool when the world got hot. The leader stopped a few feet away, his shadow swallowing the bench whole. Up close, he was even bigger than Ethan had clocked, 6 foot something of pure muscle, his leather jacket stretched tight over his barrel chest, the snake tattoo seeming to writhe as he flexed his neck. "Hey, kid," the guy rasped, his voice like gravel scraped over steel. "What's a little punk like you doing sitting here like you own the damn place?" Ethan closed his book slowly, resting it on his knee. He met the man's stare, unblinking, his hazel eyes steady as a blade. "Waiting for my brother," he said, clipped and calm. No trace of fear, just facts. The biker smirked, a ugly twist of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. He glanced back at his crew, 4 other hard cases, all grinning like they'd just found their evening entertainment. "This ain't your kind of spot, pretty boy," he said, stepping closer, his boots kicking up dust. "Maybe you ought to run along before you get hurt." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his face stayed stone cold. "It's a public park," he shot back, voice low but sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm not going anywhere." The smirk vanished. The biker's eyes narrowed, and the air between them crackled with something dark, something dangerous. Behind him, his crew fanned out, forming a loose semicircle around the bench. Ethan's pulse kicked up a notch, but he didn't let it show. His hands stayed loose on his knees, ready but relaxed, every muscle coiled like a spring waiting to snap. He scanned the park. Luke was still out there, oblivious, chasing the ball with his teammates. No one else seemed to notice the storm brewing under the oak tree. Not yet. "Got a smart mouth, huh?" the leader growled, leaning in close enough that Ethan could smell the sour tang of cheap beer on his breath. "Let's see how smart you are when I wipe that look off your face." Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. 8 years of karate, countless nights of sparring in the garage with his dad, and a mind sharper than most adults. He wasn't some kid they could scare off with a few tough words, but he wasn't reckless either. "When strong, appear weak," Sun Tzu whispered in his head. He exhaled slow, buying time, waiting for their next move. Then he heard it, a small, shaky voice cutting through the haze. "Leave him alone!" Ethan's head snapped to the side. Luke stood a dozen yards away, his soccer cleats caked with mud, his chest heaving from the game. The kid's blue eyes were wide with a mix of fear and defiance, his fists balled at his sides. "Luke, stay back," Ethan called, his tone firm but steady, a big brother command that carried weight. The bikers turned, their grins widening like sharks smelling blood. "That's your little sidekick?" One of them, a wiry guy with a scar across his cheek, taunted, pointing a gloved finger at Luke. "Maybe we'll teach you both a lesson." Ethan stood then, slow and deliberate, his hoodie shifting as he squared his shoulders. The air seemed to thicken, the park fading into a distant hum. His eyes locked on the leader, cold and unyielding. "Don't touch him," he said, his voice a quiet blade, slicing through the bravado. The biker laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed across the grass. "Look at this guy. Thinks he's a hero." His crew joined in, their laughter rolling like thunder. But Ethan didn't waver, didn't flinch. And in that moment, something shifted in the air, a flicker of unease in the biker's eyes. They didn't know it yet, but they just picked a fight with a storm dressed as a kid. The laughter hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking as the bikers circled tighter around Ethan. The leader, the big bastard with the snake tattoo, cracked his knuckles, each pop a gunshot in the quiet. His crew fed off it, their grins stretching wider, eyes glinting with the kind of hunger you see in a dog that's been chained too long. Ethan stood there still as stone, his hoodie shadowing half his face, but those hazel eyes burned through the dusk. He wasn't scared. Not yet. Fear was a luxury he'd trained out of himself years ago, back when his dad, Jack, turned their garage into a dojo. Sweat-soaked mats, a punching bag that groaned under every hit, and lessons carved into him like scripture. Control the fight before it controls you. Inside, Ethan's mind was a machine, gears spinning fast but silent. They want me to break, he thought, clocking the way the leader's shoulders tensed, the way the wiry one with the scar shifted his weight to his left leg. They think I'm some punk they can stomp into the dirt. He let his gaze drift past them for a split second. Luke was still there, frozen near the field, his small fists trembling, but his jaw set tight. That kid had guts, more than most grown men, Ethan knew. It lit something in him, a spark that flared hot and steady. The leader took another step, boots grinding gravel into dust. "You deaf kid," he snarled, close enough now that Ethan could see the yellow stains on his teeth, the faint scar slicing through his eyebrow. "I said this ain't your place. Move, or we'll move you." His meaty hand shot up, aiming to clamp down on Ethan's shoulder. A power play, a bully's opening move. Ethan didn't blink. "Don't," he said, voice low, a warning wrapped in velvet. The biker froze mid-motion, caught off guard by the steel in Ethan's tone. His hand hovered there, inches from the hoodie, and for a heartbeat the park held its breath. Then the guy laughed again, louder this time, turning to his crew like Ethan was the punchline to some private joke. "Hear that, boys? Little man's got a death wish." That's when Luke's voice cracked through again, sharp and desperate. "I said leave him alone!" The kid took a step forward, his soccer jersey streaked with mud, eyes blazing with a mix of terror and loyalty. Ethan's chest tightened. "Damn it, Luke, not now!" "Luke, back off!" Ethan snapped, louder than he meant to, his words a whip cutting through the chaos. But it was too late. The biker's head swiveled, their attention shifting to the smaller target. The wiry one with the scar chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "Aw, look at the baby brother. What's he gonna do, kick us with his little cleats?" Ethan moved then, fluid as water, stepping between Luke and the pack. "I told you," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Don't touch him." The words weren't loud, weren't shouted, but they carried weight, like a blade pressed against skin, not cutting yet, just promising it could. The leader's grin twisted into something uglier. "You think you're tough, huh?" He lunged faster than Ethan expected, his fist swinging wide for Ethan's jaw. It was over before it started. Ethan shifted, left foot sliding back, body tilting just enough to let the punch sail past his face. The biker's momentum carried him forward, off balance, and Ethan struck. His left hand snapped out, locking onto the guy's wrist mid-swing, twisting it hard until a grunt of pain ripped from the man's throat. Ethan didn't stop there. His right palm slammed up fast and precise, catching the biker's elbow with a crack that echoed off the oak. The guy stumbled back, clutching his arm, his face a mask of shock and fury. "Holy!" he started, but Ethan cut him off. "I warned you," Ethan said, calm as a still lake, though his pulse thrummed like war drums in his ears. The other two moved then, spurred by their leader's stumble. The wiry one came first, scar twitching as he threw a wild haymaker. Ethan ducked low, his body a blur, and drove a spinning kick into the guy's knee. The crack of bone meeting bone was sickening, sharp and final. The biker went down hard, howling, hands clawing at the dirt. The third guy hesitated just a beat, but it was enough. Ethan pivoted, his heel arcing through the air, catching the man's ribs with a thud that knocked the wind out of him. He crumpled, gasping, one hand pressed to his side like it could hold the pain in. The park woke up then, heads turned, murmurs rippling through the crowd. A mom yanked her kid closer, a dad pulled out his phone, the screen glowing as he started recording. Ethan didn't care. His eyes stayed on the leader, who'd straightened up now, his face red as raw meat, pride bleeding out with every wheezing breath. "You little punk," the biker spat, shaking out his arm, his snake tattoo flexing like it wanted to strike. "You're gonna regret that." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. His stance said it all. Feet planted, shoulders loose, hands open but ready. 8 years of karate wasn't just muscle memory. It was a second skin. He wasn't fighting to prove anything. He was fighting to protect Luke himself, the invisible line in the sand that said this far, no further. The leader charged again, both fists swinging like sledgehammers, a roar tearing from his chest. Ethan danced back, light on his feet, dodging each blow with the grace of a shadow. The guy was strong, but sloppy. Anger made him clumsy. Ethan saw the opening, a split-second gap as the biker overextended. He stepped in, close and fast, driving a sharp strike into the man's solar plexus. The air whooshed out of him, his knees buckling as he staggered back, gasping like a fish on dry land. "Enough," Ethan said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, his voice steady but not cruel. "Walk away." For a moment it hung there, the biker wheezing, his crew sprawled in the dirt, the park holding its breath. Ethan didn't move, didn't gloat. His eyes flicked to Luke, who stared back, wide-eyed, a mix of awe and fear painting his freckled face. The tension was a live wire, sparking, ready to ignite again. And then the leader laughed. a ragged, bitter sound. "This ain't over, kid," he croaked, jabbing a finger at Ethan as he backed off, waving his crew to follow. They limped to their bikes, curses spitting from their lips, engines roaring to life as they peeled out, gravel spraying like shrapnel. Ethan watched them go, his breathing even, his hands unclenching slow. The crowd erupted then. Claps, whispers, a kid yelling, "That was badass!" But Ethan didn't smile. He knelt by Luke, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You okay, bud?" Luke nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah." "Ethan, how'd you do that?" Ethan's lips twitched, the ghost of a grin. "Practice," he said simply, standing up. "Come on, let's get home." But as they turned to leave, Ethan's mind wouldn't settle. The leader's words gnawed at him. "This ain't over, kid." Something about it felt heavier than an empty threat, something personal, and deep down, Ethan knew this wasn't just a random scrap in the park. The storm wasn't done with him yet. Part 3. Shadows of Secrets. The roar of the Harleys faded into the twilight, swallowed by the hum of crickets and the distant chatter of the crowd still buzzing from the fight. Ethan stood there a moment longer, the gravel beneath his sneakers still warm from where the bikers had peeled out, their curses lingering like exhaust fumes in the air. His hands unclenched fully now, the adrenaline ebbing slow, leaving a faint tremor in his fingers he wouldn't let anyone see. Luke shuffled closer, his muddy cleats scuffing the ground, those wide blue eyes locked on his brother like Ethan had just stepped out of a comic book. "You sure you're okay?" Ethan asked again, softer this time, crouching to meet Luke's gaze. His voice was steady, but inside his mind was still racing, replaying every move, every word, especially that last jagged promise from the leader. "This ain't over, kid." It stuck in his throat like a splinter, sharp and nagging. Luke nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, they were huge, Ethan. And you—" He stopped, shaking his head like he couldn't find the words. "You're like freaking Batman or something." Ethan let out a quiet huff, almost a laugh, ruffling Luke's sweaty curls. "Batman's got gadgets. I've just got a mean roundhouse." He straightened up, slinging an arm around his brother's shoulders. "Come on, Mom's gonna kill us if we're late." They started across the park, the crowd parting like a tide, some clapping, some whispering, a few still filming with their phones. Ethan ignored it all, his focus split between Luke's uneven steps beside him and the unease coiling tighter in his gut. The fight was over, yeah, but something about it didn't sit right. Those bikers hadn't just stumbled across him. The way the leader sneered, the weight in his eyes, it wasn't random. It felt personal. Halfway to the sidewalk, the leader's voice clawed its way back into his head, louder this time, jagged as broken glass. "This ain't over, kid," he'd spat, pointing that thick, calloused finger like it was a loaded gun. And then Ethan froze mid-step, his breath catching as the memory sharpened. Something else, something he'd missed in the heat of it all. The guy hadn't just threatened him. He'd said something more, something that hit like a sucker punch now that it clicked. "I know who you are, Caldwell." Ethan's heart thudded hard, once, twice, loud enough he swore Luke could hear it. Caldwell? How the hell did that meathead know his last name? He hadn't said it. Not to them, not to anyone in the park. His mind kicked into overdrive, gears grinding as he retraced the last 10 minutes. He'd given them nothing. No name. No clue who he was. So how? "Ethan?" Luke's voice snapped him back, small and worried. "You okay? You look weird." "Yeah," Ethan lied, forcing a tight smile as he nudged Luke forward. "Just thinking. Keep walking, bud." But his eyes darted now, scanning the tree line, the parking lot, the shadows stretching long and thin under the sodium glow of the streetlights. The crowd was thinning out, parents herding kids to minivans, the soccer field emptying as dusk settled in. Everything looked normal. Too normal, and that's what made his skin crawl. "Know your enemy and know yourself," Sun Tzu whispered in his head, a mantra he'd leaned on since he was old enough to throw a punch. He knew himself, every strength, every flaw, every scar from years of training with his dad. But these guys, he didn't know them. not their names, not their game. And yet they knew him. That flipped the board, turned the fight from a one-off scrap into something bigger, something he couldn't see the edges of yet. Luke tugged at his sleeve, pointing toward the field. "My ball's still over there. Can we grab it?" Ethan nodded, distracted, following Luke as they veered off the path. His thoughts churned darker with every step. 5 years ago, maybe 6, he remembered a night that never sat right. He'd been 10, Luke just a toddler, when their dad, Jack, came home late, his Marine jacket slung over one shoulder, his face hard as granite. Ethan had overheard him talking to Mom through the cracked bedroom door, low, tense words about testifying and some bad people who wouldn't forget. Jack had shut it down fast when he caught Ethan listening, crouching down to his level with those steady gray eyes. "One day, kid, you might have to stand up to the mess I left behind," he'd said, voice rough but warm. "When that happens, you'll be ready." Ethan had nodded then, too young to get it, filing it away like a half-solved puzzle. Until now. The pieces were slamming together. Jack's past, the bikers, that name dropped like a brick through a window. Caldwell, his fists clenched tight at his sides, nails digging into his palms. This wasn't about a smart-mouthed kid in a park. This was revenge, old and festering, reaching out from the shadows of his dad's history to grab him by the throat. He stopped cold, Luke bumping into him from behind. "What's wrong?" Luke asked, clutching his soccer ball now, his voice trembling just enough to pull Ethan's focus back. Ethan turned, meeting his brother's eyes. "Nothing," he said, softer than before, but his mind was a storm now, lightning flashing through every thought. "Let's go." They'd barely taken 2 steps when the leader's voice roared back from the edge of the lot, carried on the wind like a taunt from a ghost. "You can't run from this, Caldwell. Your old man screwed us, and now it's your turn." The words hit Ethan like a freight train, confirmation slamming into suspicion. He spun around, but the bikers were gone, taillights flickering red in the distance, swallowed by the night. Luke's face paled, his ball slipping from his hands to roll a few feet away. "Ethan, what's he talking about? Dad?" Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking under his skin. He didn't have an answer. Not a good one, not yet. But inside, the storm was raging full force now. "Your old man screwed us." Jack had enemies, ones with long memories and short fuses, and they'd found him, found them. "Come on," Ethan said, grabbing Luke's hand, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "We're getting home. Now." As they hurried down the sidewalk, the streetlights buzzing overhead, Ethan's mind locked onto one truth. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and whatever came next, he'd face it, not as a kid caught off guard, but as the storm they'd never see coming. The sidewalk stretched ahead like a ribbon of shadow, the streetlights flickering overhead as Ethan pulled Luke along, his grip firm but not rough. The night had turned cold, the air biting at their skin, but Ethan barely felt it. His pulse hammered in his ears, a war drum keeping time with the questions tearing through his head. "Your old man screwed us." The biker's words looped, relentless, each syllable a match struck against the dry tinder of his thoughts. Luke stumbled beside him, clutching his soccer ball now, his breath puffing out in quick, nervous bursts. "Ethan, slow down. What's going on?" "Not now, Luke," Ethan said, sharper than he meant, his eyes darting to the dark corners of Fairview's quiet streets. The park was a fading echo behind them, the crowd's murmurs long gone, but the weight of that last taunt clung to him like damp leather. Caldwell. They knew his name. They knew his dad. And whatever Jack had done, whatever mess he'd left buried in the past, it was clawing its way back to life, right here, right now. Ethan's mind raced, piecing it together. Jack's late nights years ago, the hushed fights with Mom, that steely promise in the garage. "You'll be ready." He'd always thought it was just tough guy talk, a Marine's way of raising a son. But now it felt like a warning he'd been too young to decode. His fists clenched tighter, nails biting into his palms. He wasn't scared, not exactly. He'd faced down 3 bikers without blinking. But this was different. This was a ghost he couldn't punch. They'd made it 2 blocks, the familiar glow of their porch light just peeking into view when the night split open again. A siren wailed. Short, sharp, not the drawn-out howl of a patrol car chasing a speeder. Ethan froze, instincts flaring, pulling Luke behind him as headlights sliced through the dark. A black SUV screeched to a stop at the curb, tires smoking faintly against the asphalt. The passenger door flew open, and a figure stepped out, boots hitting the ground with a thud that echoed in Ethan's chest. For a second, he didn't recognize him, not under the battered leather jacket, the baseball cap pulled low over his brow. Then the man turned, the streetlight catching the hard lines of his face, the gray eyes that could cut through steel. Jack Caldwell, his dad. "Dad?" Luke squeaked, stepping out from behind Ethan, his ball slipping to the ground again. Jack didn't answer right away. He strode forward, his presence filling the space like a thunderhead rolling in, heavy and electric. His gaze swept over Luke, then locked on Ethan, sharp, assessing, like he was counting every bruise Ethan didn't have. "You boys okay?" His voice was gravel and grit, the same tone Ethan remembered from those garage nights. But there was something else in it now, something urgent. "Yeah," Ethan said, slow, his own eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" Jack didn't flinch, didn't dodge the question. He pulled the cap off, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair, and that's when Ethan saw it, the badge clipped to his belt, glinting faintly under the jacket. Not just a Marine, not just a dad, a cop. An undercover cop, if the unmarked SUV and the way he carried himself were any clue. Ethan's stomach dropped, the puzzle snapping together so fast it stole his breath. "Get in the car," Jack said, nodding toward the SUV. "Now." Ethan didn't move. "Not until you tell me what's going on. Those bikers, they knew my name, Dad. They said you screwed them." His voice cracked on the last word, anger and confusion bleeding through the calm he'd fought to keep. Jack's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking under the stubble. He stepped closer, close enough that Ethan could smell the faint tang of coffee and gun oil on him. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this," he said, low, almost to himself. Then his eyes met Ethan's again, steady as bedrock. "5 years ago, I put a man away. Ricky Vance, head of the Iron Reapers. Drugs, guns, the works. I testified, went deep cover to make it stick. Thought it was done. But his brother's out now, Dwayne Vance. Big guy, snake tattoo. Sound familiar?" Ethan's blood ran cold. The leader, the shaved head, the ink curling around his neck. Dwayne. "He came after me," Ethan said, voice flat, piecing it together. "At the park. Tonight." Jack nodded, grim. "He's been tracking me. Found you instead." He paused, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder, heavy but not crushing. "I've been watching from a distance. Had a tail on you since I got wind he was loose. Didn't think he'd move this fast." Before Ethan could process it, before he could ask why Jack hadn't told him, the growl of engines ripped through the night again. Headlights flared at the end of the street, 5 bikes tearing toward them, dust kicking up like a war party on the charge. Dwayne's voice bellowed over the roar, raw and wild. "You're done, Caldwell, both of you." Ethan tensed, ready to move, but Jack was faster. He shoved Luke toward the SUV. "Inside now." Then turned, pulling a Glock from under his jacket with the smooth precision of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. "Ethan, stay behind me," he barked, stepping into the street, gun raised but not firing. The bike skidded to a stop 20 yards out, gravel spraying. Dwayne swung off his Harley, his snake tattoo gleaming under the streetlights, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can hide behind your kid, Jack?" he shouted, fist balled, his crew fanning out behind him. "You put Ricky in a cage. He died in there. This is payback." Jack didn't flinch, didn't lower the gun. "Walk away, Dwayne," he said, voice like thunder, rolling slow. "Touch my boys and you'll wish you'd stayed in whatever hole you crawled out of." Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't back down. He stepped up beside Jack, hands loose but ready, his training kicking in like a second pulse. "You heard him," Ethan said, locking eyes with Dwayne. "You lost once tonight. Want to try again?" Dwayne's glare shifted, bouncing between father and son, and for a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, maybe fear. Jack's presence was a wall, unyielding, the Glock steady as death. Ethan was the wild card, calm and coiled, a kid who'd already dropped 3 of his men without breaking a sweat. The math didn't add up for Dwayne, and he knew it. "Fall back," Dwayne growled finally, spitting on the ground as he waved his crew off. "This ain't the end, Caldwell. Not by a long shot." The bikes roared to life, peeling out into the night, their taillights swallowed by the dark once more. Ethan exhaled, the tension draining slow, but his eyes stayed on Jack. "Undercover?" he asked, voice tight. "All this time?" Jack holstered the Glock, turning to face him. "Yeah," he said, softer now. "I kept it quiet to keep you safe. Guess that didn't work out." He clapped Ethan's shoulder, a faint, proud glint in his eyes. "But you handled it, kid, like I knew you would." Ethan didn't know whether to be mad or relieved. Maybe both. But as Luke peeked out from the SUV, wide-eyed and trembling, one thing was clear. The storm wasn't over. It was just getting started. The night draped Fairview in a shroud of quiet, the last echoes of the bikers' engines swallowed by the dark, leaving only the soft chirp of crickets and the faint hum of streetlights cutting through the stillness. Ethan stood rooted to the pavement, his breath steady now, the cold biting at his knuckles as he watched the red glow of Dwayne's taillights vanish around the corner. That final snarl, "This ain't the end, Caldwell," lingered like a bruise, tender but not breaking him. Beside him, Jack's SUV sat silent, its engine ticking down like a heartbeat slowing after a sprint. Luke bolted from the passenger seat, his soccer ball abandoned in the dirt, his small frame shaking as he barreled into Ethan. "They're really gone?" he asked, voice a fragile thread, his blue eyes darting between his brother and their dad, searching for solid ground. "Yeah, bud," Ethan said, dropping to one knee to pull Luke into a fierce, quick hug. "They're gone. For now." His tone was a rock, steady for Luke's sake, but inside the storm still churned. Anger at Jack's secrets, relief at their safety, and a quiet pride he couldn't shake. He rose, turning to Jack, who stood a few steps off, holstering his Glock with the calm of a man who danced with shadows and won. Jack's gray eyes met Ethan's, sharp but softened by a flicker of something raw. Pride, guilt, a father's weight. "You handled yourself out there, Ethan," he said, voice rough as gravel but warm at the edges. "Kept Luke safe, kept your cool. That's more than I could have asked." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. "You should have told me," he said, the words slipping out hard and unpolished, carrying the sting of the night. "About the Reapers, the trial, everything. I was blind out there, Dad." Jack let out a long, heavy breath, like he was exhaling years of silence. He stepped closer, the streetlight carving deep lines into his face. "I didn't want this touching you," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with regret. "Thought I could bury it, keep you and Luke out of the blast zone. After I put Ricky Vance away, I went under, tracked his crew from a distance. Had eyes on you when I heard Dwayne was out. Didn't expect him to move this fast." He rested a hand on Ethan's shoulder, firm but not crushing. "I messed up, kid. I'm sorry." Ethan held his gaze, the anger still simmering but softening under Jack's honesty. He glanced at Luke, pressed tight against his side, then back at his dad. Jack wasn't just a shadow with a badge. He was a man who'd built a wall of secrets to shield them, even if it had cracked tonight. "Does Mom know?" Ethan asked, quieter now. The edge dulled. Jack's lips twitched, a wry half-smile breaking through. "Enough to chew me out when we get home. She's the real storm, you know that." Ethan snorted, a small laugh slipping free. "Yeah, she'll lock you in the garage before she grounds me." Jack's chuckle rumbled low, a rare sound that cut through the night's weight like a blade through fog. He nodded toward the SUV. "Let's get you boys home." Full story there, no more shadows. Promise. The drive was a quiet hum, the engine's drone wrapping around them like a blanket. Luke slumped in the back, head against the window, exhaustion pulling him under. Ethan rode shotgun, staring out at the moon, a fat silver disk hanging low over Fairview, spilling light across the rooftops like molten steel. His mind traced the night's jagged edges, the clash under the oak, Dwayne's venom, Jack's gun glinting in the dark. But what stuck wasn't the fight. It was the moment he'd stood tall, turned chaos into something he could hold, something he could win. They pulled into the driveway, the porch light glowing warm against the night. Mom waited in the doorway, arms crossed, her silhouette a fortress of worry and steel. Jack cut the engine, glancing at Ethan. "Ready for the firing squad?" "Always," Ethan said, a real smile tugging at his lips. Inside, the kitchen smelled of coffee and cinnamon, Mom's late-night armor. She didn't yell, not yet, just yanked Luke into a hug and pinned Jack with a look that could have forged iron. Ethan leaned against the counter, letting the familiar hum of home settle his nerves as Jack laid it out. Ricky Vance, the trial, the years chasing ghosts. Ethan listened, filling in the gaps, but his thoughts kept drifting to Luke's shaky courage, to the way he'd faced down the storm and walked away stronger. Later, after Mom had tucked Luke in and Jack had retreated to face her quiet fury, Ethan slipped into his room. The moon streamed through the window, silver ribbons pulling on the hardwood. He kicked off his sneakers, flopping onto the bed, the Art of War still in his hoodie pocket. As he pulled it out, something clinked against the floor, a small, dull metal rectangle glinting in the light. He froze, reaching for it. A Marine dog tag, worn and scratched, stamped with J. Caldwell and a service number. Ethan's breath caught. He turned it over, finding a faint inscription scratched into the back. 4E, stand tall. His chest tightened, a spark flaring hot and steady. Jack must have slipped it into his pocket sometime tonight, maybe in the SUV, maybe on the porch. A silent handoff, a piece of his dad's faith carried through years of silence and now pressed into Ethan's palm. He clutched it tight, the edges biting into his skin, and flipped open the book to a familiar line. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. He smiled small but fierce, an ember that could torch the night. Tonight wasn't about fists or guns. It was about seizing that chance, standing up when the world tried to bury him. He slipped out to Luke's room, leaning in the doorway. "Hey, Luke," he whispered. Luke stirred, blinking up through the dark. "Yeah?" "Real strength isn't beating someone down," Ethan said, voice low and sure. "It's knowing who you are, and not letting anyone steal that." Luke nodded, eyes bright. "Like you tonight." "Like us tonight," Ethan corrected, grinning. "Sleep tight, tough guy." He eased the door shut, the house settling around him like a shield. Back in his room, he slid the dog tag into his pocket, the book resting on his chest. The storm had passed, for now, but if it roared back, he'd be ready, not just with his hands, but with the unshakable core he'd forged tonight. Under the moonlight, Ethan Caldwell closed his eyes, a quiet storm dreaming of the battles ahead.